Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into Rome, while the stars are still on duty and the streets smell faintly of ash, grain dust, and yesterday's olive oil. You're walking barefoot in your imagination across stone that hasn't yet decided whether it's still night or already morning, and somewhere ahead of you, an oven door slams shut with the dull authority of a schedule that does not care about your sleep. The city is mostly still, but not peaceful, because the bakeries are awake, glowing like watchful eyes in the dark, and you are about to realize that Rome's bread is born, while emperors are drooling gently into embroidered pillows. This is where you probably won't survive this, not because of violence or drama, but because you're about to notice how brutally early everything important actually starts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move closer to a bakery door just as it creaks open and warm air spills out like a sigh. Inside, the ovens are already roaring, even though the sun hasn't even thought about rising. This is not a mistake. Roman bakers do not wake up early, they wake up yesterday. Long before dawn, before senators stir, and before the emperor's household even thinks about morning rituals, dough is already being shaped by hands that have barely rested. A mainstream historical fact slips in quietly here. Rome depended on a massive daily bread supply to keep its urban population fed, and fresh bread was expected early in the morning, not at noon, not later, but right at the start of the day. That expectation alone shoves bakers into a schedule that laughs at the concept of sleep. You stand there watching flour float through torchlight like pale snow, and you realize something uncomfortable. Bread is not optional. Rome is too big, too crowded, and too hungry. The grain dole feeds citizens with raw grain. Yes, but bread, warm, ready-to-eat bread, is what keeps tempers down and routines moving. Bakers cannot wait for sunrise to begin. They have to finish before sunrise. So while emperors, even anxious ones, are wrapped in layers of linen and guarded silence, bakers are already sweating, counting loaves, and judging dough by touch alone. Joke once slips in gently. You complain when your alarm rings at 7 a.m., while these people are already on their second existential crisis, before birds wake up. You start to sense the rhythm of their night. Mixing begins in deep darkness. Kneading follows, heavy and repetitive, the kind of motion that makes your shoulders ache just by watching it. The ovens must be heated slowly and steadily, which means fires are lit hours earlier. Here's a quirky tidbit that always surprises people. Some Roman bakeries used human or animal-powered mills attached directly to the workspace, meaning grinding grain and baking bread happened almost back-to-back, often under the same roof. The noise alone, stone on stone, wood cracking in the heat, would have shredded any idea of restful nighttime silence. Sleep deprivation isn't a side effect here, it's baked into the process. You step back into the street for a moment and notice how quiet the rest of Rome is by comparison. This is where contrast does the storytelling for you. Elite Romans, including emperors, often kept late hours socially, but still had the luxury of flexible mornings. If an emperor slept badly, the empire did not collapse. If bakers slept badly, or worse, overslept, people noticed immediately. Hunger is loud, hunger turns political fast. And so bakers, whether free, freed, or enslaved, absorb that pressure into their bones. Joke too drifts by. Modern hustle culture likes to brag about waking up at 5 a.m., but Roman bakers would look at that and say, "Cute, come back at midnight." As you hover between street and bakery, historians still argue whether bakers' sleeplessness was driven more by state pressure or by market competition. Some scholars emphasize legal expectations and public demand, while others point to economic incentives. Finish earlier, sell earlier, survive another day. That debate matters because it changes how you see these people, either as victims of a system that never slept, or as operators inside it, making brutal choices because the alternative was starvation. Either way, no one is romanticizing this lifestyle. There's no poetic glow here, just heat, timing, and exhaustion layered on top of civic necessity. You watch a baker test the oven with bare hands, pulling back instinctively but not stopping. That tells you everything. This is muscle memory born of repetition, not passion. Bread shapes vary slightly, stamped or cut, because timing is tight and perfection is secondary to quantity. Another mainstream fact slides in without fuss. Rome had professional baker guilds by the imperial period, meaning this was an organized, regulated industry, not a side hustle. Organization does not mean comfort. It means rules, quotas, and expectations that tighten the night even further. The smell is comforting though, and that's the dangerous part. Warm bread tricks you into forgetting the labor behind it. That's true now, and it was true then. You feel calm, even sleepy, which is deeply ironic given that everyone producing this calm is running on fumes. Joke 3 lands softly. Nothing says civilization like one group of people sacrificing sleep so everyone else can feel relaxed and full. As the first hint of gray creeps into the sky, you realize this section of the night is already ending for them. Finishing touches are rushed, loaves are stacked. The pace doesn't slow, it sharpens. Soon customers will arrive, and the city will pretend it has just woken up, unaware that its most essential workers have been awake for hours. You linger on that thought, because it sets the tone for everything that follows. Rome's greatness, its order, its daily rhythm, all lean quietly on people who never get enough rest. And as you step away from the bakery, the oven still roaring behind you, you carry one clear image forward. Emperors sleep because bakers don't. That imbalance is not accidental, it's structural. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it as we keep walking deeper into the night. You keep walking, not forward so much as sideways through time, because Rome at night doesn't unfold in straight lines. The bakery glow fades behind you, but the reason those ovens had to be lit so obscenely early now comes into focus. Grain. Everything always comes back to grain. You picture it piled in sacks, spilling like sand when torn, heavy enough to bend backs and shape laws. Rome does not trust chance when it comes to food, and you can feel that distrust pressing down on every baker's schedule like a hand on the back of the neck. You pause near a granary and immediately understand the imbalance. This isn't a sleepy storehouse, it's a pressure point. A mainstream historical fact slips in cleanly here. The Roman state ran a massive grain distribution system, the Annonia, supplying hundreds of thousands of citizens with subsidized or free grain. That grain keeps bellies technically full, but it doesn't magically turn itself into bread. Someone has to wake up, grind it, mix it, bake it, and have it ready when the city stirs. And that someone is never the emperor. You imagine clerks tallying shipments, guards checking seals, and officials worrying more about numbers than human fatigue. Grain arriving late causes panic. Bread arriving late causes riots. That's not exaggeration. Rome had a long memory for food shortages, and emperors knew exactly how thin the line was between order and people throwing things. So bakers inherit the anxiety of the entire system. They are downstream from policy, politics, weather, and war. Sleep is not on the list of protected resources. As you lean against a stone wall, you realize the schedule makes brutal sense. Grain distribution often happened early in the day. Markets came alive at dawn. Freshness mattered because bread staled quickly, and Romans were picky in a way that surprises people who imagine ancient diets as universally miserable. Bakers had to beat the city awake. If they didn't, customers didn't politely wait. They went elsewhere, complained, or worse, blamed someone higher up. Joke 1 slides in. You think your boss sends emails too early, but at least your mistakes don't threaten public order. You start connecting dots. Bakers aren't just responding to hunger, they're responding to law. Municipal regulations controlled weights, prices, and sometimes even working practices. This is where a quirky tidbit creeps in. In some periods, bakers were legally bound to their profession, especially those connected to state supply, meaning you couldn't just quit baking and decide to become a poet because you were tired. Imagine being locked into a job where chronic exhaustion is part of the contract. Suddenly, sleeping less than emperors doesn't sound symbolic, it sounds mandatory. The city begins to murmur now, carts creaking in the distance, sandals scuffing stone. You feel the tension between abundance and fragility. Rome imports grain from far away, North Africa, Egypt, and every delay ripples inward. When ships arrive late, bakers don't get to say, "Sorry, supply chain issues." they compressed their nights even further. Historians still argue whether baker exhaustion increased during periods of grain instability, or whether bakers were already operating at maximum strain regardless. The sources don't agree, but your instincts tell you this. When systems tighten, the people at the bottom feel it first and hardest. You drift back toward the bakery district in your mind and notice how timing dominates everything. Dough has a window, ovens have a rhythm. Miss it, and the entire day skews off balance. There is no buffer. That's the quiet cruelty here. Emperors had margins, advisors, servants, delay. Bakers had clocks made of fermentation and fire. Joke 2 arrives gently. Sourdough waits for no man, not even Caesar. You picture the emperor's mourning now, not because he's important, but because the contrast sharpens the scene. He wakes when he wants, eats when he wants, and if the bread is late, someone else absorbs the blame. That separation is structural, not personal. Power insulates. Labor absorbs shock. Bakers live inside time pressure the way fish live in water. It surrounds them so completely they don't even comment on it anymore. Their exhaustion is invisible because it's normalized. As the first customers approach, you feel the city snapping into daytime mode, like a switch thrown. Bread sales begin almost immediately. This tells you something crucial. There was no gentle ramp up to the day. Rome went from asleep to hungry in moments. Bakers needed to be ahead of that curve, not chasing it. That's why their nights stretch backward so far. They aren't early, everyone else is late. Another mainstream fact slides in without ceremony. Bread was a daily staple for most urban Romans, not an occasional treat. That daily expectation is what drives everything. You can skip wine, you can tolerate thin soup, you do not mess with bread. And so bakers, knowingly or not, became the human buffers that allowed emperors to appear generous and cities to appear stable. You stand there long enough to feel the irony settle in. The system is impressive. It works. Rome eats, but it works by quietly burning through human energy at the edges. Bakers pay for predictability with sleep. Joke 3 lands softly. Modern logistics companies would call this just-in-time delivery, but the Romans perfected it using insomnia. You take one last look at the granary, the bakery, the waking street, and you carry the understanding forward. Bakers didn't sleep less because they were inefficient or poorly organized. They slept less because Rome demanded certainty every morning, and certainty has a cost. As you move on, that cost hums under your thoughts, steady and unresolved, like an oven that never quite goes cold. You don't stop walking, because stopping would imply rest, and rest is exactly what the bakers don't get. The deeper you drift into Rome's night, the clearer it becomes that this sleeplessness isn't just habit, it's engineered. Laws hover over the streets like an unspoken curfew, and yet here you are, surrounded by people very much awake. This is where things get interesting, because Rome officially disliked nighttime labor. Night was supposed to be for sleep, prayer, or at least staying indoors and not causing trouble. And yet, bread still had to appear at dawn, warm and reliable, as if time itself had bent the rules. You start to see how bakers slipped through the cracks. Roman law often restricted noisy or disruptive work at night, especially inside dense urban areas where fires, crime, and chaos were real fears. But baking, conveniently, sat in a gray zone. It was essential. It was quiet enough compared to metalworking or construction. And most importantly, it could be framed as preparation rather than production. Mixing dough, grinding grain, heating ovens, these were all conveniently labeled as necessary preliminaries, not full labor. That linguistic trick alone bought bakers hours of legal darkness. A mainstream historical fact slides in here without fanfare. Roman law was famously flexible when public necessity was involved. Bread counted as necessity. So while other trades shut down after sunset, bakeries hummed along, tolerated because shutting them would risk unrest. You can almost hear the logic. Better a few sleepless bakers than an angry crowd by mid-morning. From the state's perspective, this wasn't exploitation, it was pragmatism. From the baker's perspective, it was another night written off. You imagine officials looking the other way as long as the streets stayed calm. Bakers learned quickly how far they could push it. Ovens were built deeper inside structures to reduce visible light. Work moved inward, quieter, more controlled. This wasn't rebellion, it was adaptation. And once a loophole exists, it becomes routine. Soon no one questions why bakers are awake at hours when others are legally supposed to be horizontal. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into textbooks. Some bakeries synchronize their night work with other acceptable nocturnal activities, like milling or transport tied to state supply. If grain was being moved under official oversight, baking could plausibly follow. It's bureaucratic judo. Use the system's own rules to keep working. You start to realize that Roman bakers weren't just tired. They were legally savvy in the way only exhausted people forced into consistency ever become. Joke 1 slips in quietly. You complain about tax loopholes today, but ancient bakers were out here inventing sleep loopholes just to survive. As you hover in this legal twilight, historians still argue whether these nighttime exemptions were formally recognized or simply tolerated out of convenience. Some evidence suggests written permissions in certain cities. Other sources imply informal acceptance, enforced unevenly. That uncertainty matters. If the exemptions were official, the state bears clear responsibility. If they were informal, bakers lived with constant risk, fined today, punished tomorrow, depending on who noticed and how grumpy they were. You feel that tension now. Every night shift carries a background hum of anxiety. Fires spread faster in darkness. Complaints traveled upward unpredictably. One neighbor with influence could shut a bakery down temporarily, wrecking an entire schedule. So bakers worked fast, efficiently, and with as little attention as possible. Sleep loss here isn't just about time, it's about vigilance. You can't sleep deeply if you're always half listening for trouble. You catch yourself comparing this to emperors again, because the contrast keeps insisting on being noticed. Emperors made laws that bent for necessity. Bakers lived inside the bend. If an emperor broke a rule, it became precedent. If a baker broke a rule, it became punishment, unless the bread was ready on time, in which case everyone mysteriously forgot to care. Another mainstream fact settles in. Urban Rome depended on specialized labor operating outside ideal conditions. Night baking wasn't an accident, it was a tolerated distortion of civic order. That distortion landed squarely on the backs of workers who couldn't afford to argue. Emperors might lose sleep over conspiracies. Bakers lost sleep over ovens going cold. Joke 2 drifts by. It turns out, working late is easier to justify when the alternative is riots. As dawn approaches again, you sense how normalized this all becomes. Once a rule is bent enough times, it stops feeling bent. Bakers don't think of themselves as rule breakers. They think of themselves as on schedule. Night becomes their day. Sleep becomes fragmented, stolen in daylight hours when the city is loud and unforgiving. Meanwhile, official Rome continues pretending that nighttime is quiet and orderly. You stand in that contradiction for a moment, feeling how the system holds itself together through selective blindness. Bakers slept less than emperors, not because the law demanded it explicitly, but because the law quietly allowed it. That subtle difference makes all the difference. And as you move forward, the night still clinging to you, you realize that once sleep becomes negotiable, it's always the powerless who end up bargaining it away. Joke 3 lands softly as you drift onward. Rome didn't outlaw sleep for bakers. It just priced it out of reach. You step back inside the bakery because the law might explain why bakers work at night, but the ovens explain how they survive it. The heat hits you immediately, thick and physical, like walking into someone else's exhaustion. This isn't a cozy hearth. Roman ovens are monsters, brick domes that swallow wood and spit out sustained, punishing heat for hours on end. They are designed not for comfort, but for volume. And once they're hot, they demand constant attention. You don't casually walk away from a Roman oven. You orbit it, the way tired planets circle a sun that doesn't care if they burn. A mainstream historical fact settles in early here. Roman bakeries used large, wood-fired masonry ovens that had to be heated for long periods before baking could even begin. That heating phase alone could take hours, which means if you want bread at dawn, you're lighting fires deep in the night. There is no shortcut. There is no, we'll start in the morning. The physics of baked clay and retained heat dictate your sleep schedule with absolute authority. You watch sweat roll down backs already streaked with flour. The air is smoky, even with vents and open doors, and it scratches at your throat in a way that makes you instinctively swallow. Bakers work stripped down, not out of casualness, but necessity. Heat exhaustion wasn't a dramatic event, it was a constant background condition. Sleep deprivation layered on top of that turns every movement slower, heavier, less forgiving. This is where exhaustion stops being abstract and starts being measurable, in dropped loaves, burned crusts, misjudged timing. Here's a quirky tidbit that doesn't get enough attention. Roman bakers often tested oven readiness by feel, not tools. No thermometers, no gauges. A hand thrust briefly inside, a quick calculation made by nerves trained over years. Now imagine doing that at 3 in the morning, eyes gritty, muscles already tired, judgment dulled by lack of rest. This isn't craftsmanship born of romance. It's survival honed under pressure. Joke one slides in, dry as flour. Modern chefs complain about hot kitchens, but at least they get 8 hours of sleep and an OSHA poster. You start to understand that heat reshapes time itself inside these spaces. Minutes stretch. The night feels endless, not because it is long, but because the work never pauses. Once the oven is ready, everything accelerates. Dough must go in, loaves must rotate, ash must be managed. Mistakes compound quickly. There's no quiet moment to sit down and breathe. The heat keeps you upright, alert, and miserable. Sleepiness here isn't gentle, it's dangerous. Historians still argue whether the physical toll of oven heat shortened bakers' lives more than their lack of sleep did. Some emphasize respiratory damage from smoke, others point to chronic fatigue and strain injuries. The truth is probably unsatisfying and shared. Heat and sleeplessness reinforced each other, grinding bodies down faster than either would alone. When you remove recovery from a physically brutal job, decay accelerates. Rome ran on that math. You glance toward the doorway again and see the faintest hint of early light. Outside, the air's cooler, forgiving. Inside, the ovens don't care. They don't cool just because the sky changes color. And this is where another uncomfortable realization lands. Even when the baking is done, the heat lingers. Cleaning, maintenance, preparation for the next cycle. All of it happens in the same environment. Bakers don't finish their night and step into rest. They step into aftermath. Joke 2 drifts by quietly. The oven doesn't clock out, and neither do you. You imagine trying to sleep after this. Daylight pours in. The city gets loud. Your body is overheated, dehydrated, buzzing with fatigue. Sleep becomes shallow, interrupted, more like collapse than rest. This isn't one bad night. This is routine. Heat doesn't just steal sleep directly, it ruins the quality of the sleep you do get. That's a detail that matters, and it's one historians often infer rather than see explicitly in texts. Another mainstream fact settles in naturally. Roman urban housing was cramped, noisy, and poorly insulated. Bakers rarely had the luxury of cool, quiet sleeping spaces during the day. So even when work ended, recovery didn't truly begin. Emperors could retreat to shaded villas, controlled environments, guarded silence. Bakers collapsed wherever they could, hoping the city would briefly forget about them. You feel the cumulative weight now. Heat at night, noise during the day, law bending just enough to keep the ovens running. This isn't heroism, it's attrition. And yet, the system functioned precisely because people absorbed this punishment without ceremony. Bread appeared. The city ate. No one wrote poetry about the baker's lungs or aching joints. Joke 3 lands softly, almost apologetically. Rome had central heating for bread, not for people. As you linger in the dim interior, watching embers glow and fade, you understand why bakers slept less than emperors in the most literal sense. It wasn't ambition or devotion, it was thermodynamics. Fire demands time, heat demands attention. And once you commit to feeding a city, the ovens own your night whether the law admits it or not. You step back out again, the warmth clinging to you like a memory you didn't ask for. The sun is higher now, and the city is fully awake. Bakers are not. They are finishing, fading, handing off bread and responsibility to a world that will never notice how tired they are. And as you move on, that heat stays with you, an invisible reminder that Rome's daily comfort was forged in spaces too hot and too sleepless to be called humane. You start noticing the people now, not just the process, because ovens don't wake themselves up. Hands do, backs do, entire lives do. As the night thins and the bakery settles into its last furious stretch, you realize the question isn't why bakers slept less than emperors anymore. It's who actually paid that price. The answer is uncomfortable, layered, and very Roman. A mainstream historical fact settles in early. Most Roman bakeries were staffed by a mix of enslaved people, freedmen, and sometimes freeborn workers, often under the ownership or management of a wealthier patron. Baking was not a genteel trade. It was physical, dirty, and relentless, which meant it landed disproportionately on people with the fewest options. If you imagine a single baker lovingly crafting bread, correct yourself immediately. What you're seeing is a coordinated human machine running on fatigue. You look closer at the enslaved workers first, because their exhaustion has no legal endpoint. They don't choose night work chooses them. Sleep deprivation here isn't negotiated, it's imposed. If the oven needs feeding at midnight, someone is there. If dough must be kneaded at 2, arms move whether they want to or not. Enslaved bakers often lived on site or nearby, which sounds convenient until you realize it erased any boundary between work and rest. The bakery was not just their job, it was their entire environment. Here's a quirky tidbit that complicates the picture. Some enslaved bakers were highly skilled and valued, sometimes even trained over years. Skill didn't buy freedom, but it did buy expectation. The better you were, the more indispensable you became. And indispensability in Rome often meant less sleep, not more. Excellence was rewarded with responsibility, not relief. Joke 1 slides in quietly. Turns out being good at your job has been ruining people's sleep for at least 2,000 years. Then there are freedmen, former slaves who technically own their time, but practically don't. Many ran or managed bakeries on behalf of patrons, trapped in a middle zone of obligation and ambition. They worked nights because failure wasn't abstract. It meant debt, disgrace, or slipping backwards socially. Freedmen slept less, not because they were forced to, but because the cost of rest felt too high. That distinction matters, but not as much as people like to pretend. Families enter the picture next, and this is where the fatigue spreads sideways. Bakeries were often family operations, with children and spouses pulled into the rhythm. Night work bled into domestic life. Sleep schedules fragmented. One person rests while another works, passing exhaustion back and forth like a shared resource. Historians still argue whether family-based bakeries eased or worsened fatigue, but the evidence suggests one thing clearly. When your livelihood depends on night labor, no one in the household truly sleeps normally. You imagine children growing up thinking pre-dawn activity is normal, that firelight means morning is coming, that rest happens whenever it can be stolen. This isn't trauma in the modern clinical sense, but it's conditioning. Sleep becomes flexible, optional, unreliable, and once a culture normalizes that, it becomes very hard to undo. Joke 2 drifts in gently. Some kids had bedtime stories. Baker families had don't touch the oven stories. You contrast this again, almost reflexively, with emperors. Imperial households were built around insulating the ruler from inconvenience. Servants rotated, guards took shifts, schedules adjusted. Even when emperors worked late or rose early, it was framed as discipline or virtue, not survival. Their sleep loss, when it happened, was episodic. Baker's sleep loss was structural. One was a story told afterward. The other was a condition lived inside. Another mainstream fact weaves in naturally. By the imperial period, baking was one of the few trades closely monitored because of its importance to urban stability. That scrutiny didn't translate into protections, it translated into expectations. Output mattered, timing mattered. Human limits did not enter the calculation. You notice how authority flows inside the bakery. Orders move downward. Fatigue does too. The person least able to refuse absorbs the worst hours. That's not uniquely Roman, but Rome perfected it at scale. The empire didn't need every baker to be enslaved. It just needed enough people with no leverage to keep the system smooth. Historians still argue whether free bakers experienced significantly better conditions than enslaved ones. Some evidence suggests marginal improvements, slightly more autonomy, slightly better living arrangements. But the sleep problem persists across status. The oven doesn't care if you're free, dough rises on its own schedule. Joke 3 lands softly with a tired shrug. Freedom is nice, but it doesn't slow fermentation. You feel the emotional weight now, not in a dramatic way, but in accumulation. Sleeplessness stacks quietly. Missed rest turns into irritability, mistakes, shorter tempers. Inside families, inside workplaces, inside bodies. Rome's bread didn't just cost sleep, it redistributed exhaustion along social lines, concentrating it where resistance was weakest. As the morning advances and bread changes hands, you watch bakers fade from visibility. Enslaved workers retreat into shadows or side rooms. Freedmen tally sales with red eyes. Families begin the awkward handoff between night labor and day survival. Meanwhile, the city consumes the result and moves on, unaware that its most essential food came from people who are already halfway through tomorrow's fatigue. You carry that forward with you. Bakers slept less than emperors because Rome was designed that way, because some lives were structured to absorb deprivation so others never had to notice it. And once you see who those lives belong to, the early mornings stop feeling quaint and start feeling precise. The ovens dim slightly now, not because the work is done, but because the next cycle is already being imagined. Sleep, if it comes at all, will be short, shallow, and earned the hard way. And as you move on from the bakery, you realize the question isn't whether Rome could have done better. It's whether Rome would have functioned at all without people who never slept enough. You stay with the bakers a little longer, because now the pressure tightens in a different way. It's no longer just about making bread. It's about making the right bread, at the right time, in the right order. This is where sleep loss stops being background noise and starts actively shaping decisions. Roman bread isn't one thing. It's a spectrum, and each type drags the night in a slightly different direction. A mainstream historical fact slides in naturally. Roman cities consumed multiple kinds of bread. Panis plebeius for the masses, finer loaves for wealthier customers, specialty breads tied to status, ritual, or personal preference. These weren't interchangeable. Texture, grind, shape, and baking time mattered. That variety sounds civilized and comforting until you realize what it does to a work schedule. One oven, multiple doughs, all on different clocks. Timing becomes tyranny. You picture dough resting in baskets, each one silently counting down. Too early, and it collapses. Too late, and it sours. Sleep deprivation makes those judgments harder, not easier. A baker running on fumes doesn't get the luxury of good enough. Mistakes ripple outward, customers complain, sales dip, reputation suffers. So bakers compensate the only way they can, by waking earlier, staying longer, and narrowing their margins of error until there's no room left for rest. Here's a quirky tidbit that often surprises people. Some Roman breads were intentionally baked at different times of day to hit peak freshness during specific market hours. That meant staggered production across the night and early morning. In practical terms, someone had to be awake for all of it. Sleep became modular, snatched in fragments between batches, never whole, never satisfying. Joke one drifts in quietly. It's like running a 24-hour cafe with one espresso machine and no coffee. You feel the mental strain now. This isn't brute labor alone. It's constant calculation under fatigue. Which dough goes in first? Which customer arrives earliest? Which batch can't afford a delay? Bakers learn to think in rhythms rather than hours because clocks lie when you're tired. The body wants rest, but fermentation doesn't negotiate. You realize how modern this problem feels. The tools are ancient. The stress is timeless. Historians still argue whether bread variety significantly increased baker exhaustion, or whether skilled bakers adapted efficiently enough to absorb the complexity. Some evidence suggests specialization, certain bakeries focusing on fewer types, while other sources imply wide production was expected. Either way, variety doesn't simplify sleep, it fragments it further. You glance again at the emperor, metaphorically speaking, because the contrast sharpens your understanding. Imperial kitchens produce variety too, but with layered staffing, redundancy, and the ability to delay. If a dish wasn't perfect, it could be remade. If a baker burned a batch, there was no backup. Time lost at 3 in the morning couldn't be recovered at 9. Another mainstream fact settles in. Roman markets opened early, and customers expected bread immediately. There was no concept of fresh later. Fresh meant now. That expectation pinned bakers to the darkest hours of the night, regardless of how many varieties they were juggling. Sleep didn't just shrink, it shattered. Joke 2 slips in gently. Nothing keeps you awake like knowing a crowd is waiting to judge your crust. You start to see how precision becomes a coping mechanism. Bakers lean on routine, repetition, and muscle memory to survive exhaustion. Variety doesn't disappear, it becomes automated in the mind. Hands move before thought. Decisions feel instinctive. This looks like mastery from the outside, but inside, it's compensation. When sleep goes, intuition takes over because conscious calculation is too slow. That has a cost. Intuition under fatigue is brittle. One disruption, a delayed grain delivery, a broken oven tool, a sudden order, can unravel the entire night. That's when tempers flare. That's when mistakes multiply. You imagine the quiet panic of realizing at 4 in the morning that a batch is wrong and there's no time to fix it before the market opens. Joke 3 lands softly, almost sympathetically. Sourdough doesn't care about your emotional state. You linger on the image of stacked loaves, each representing a decision made while tired. Bread variety, often celebrated as evidence of Roman sophistication, carries an invisible price tag paid in lost sleep. The more choice the city demanded, the less rest its bakers received. That trade-off rarely appears in inscriptions or praise, but it's there in every early morning sale. As the sky brightens again, you feel how relentless this cycle is. Variety doesn't end with dawn. Orders continue, preferences shift. Tomorrow night, it starts again. Bakers don't sleep less than emperors because they lack discipline or organization. They sleep less because complexity multiplies labor, and labor expands to fill the night. You move on carrying that understanding with you. Bread isn't just sustenance here, it's scheduling pressure made edible. And as long as Rome demands choice at sunrise, someone will be awake long before it, counting minutes instead of hours, trading sleep for precision without ever being thanked for either. You follow the sound before you see it, a low, grinding groan that feels older than the city itself. This is where the night really stretches, because bread doesn't begin in ovens. It begins in mills, and mills do not respect dawn. You step closer and realize that for bakers, sleep is already gone by the time flour even exists. What you're hearing is grain being turned into inevitability. A mainstream historical fact settles in cleanly here. By the imperial period, Rome relied heavily on large-scale mills, including water-powered mills, to grind vast quantities of grain for urban consumption. Some of these mills operated continuously to meet demand. Water doesn't get tired, and once you harness it, the pressure shifts entirely onto the humans feeding and managing the system. Grain has to be ready before baking can even begin, which pushes work backward into the deepest hours of the night. You imagine workers hauling sacks in near darkness, aligning themselves with the rhythm of turning stones. The milling stage is loud, repetitive, and oddly hypnotic. Stone scrapes stone. Flour dust hangs in the air. It coats skin, lungs, and sleep schedules. Bakers either mill grain themselves or depend on someone else who already hasn't slept. Either way, by the time dough is mixed, exhaustion is already layered in. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost unfair. Some Roman mills, especially water-powered ones, ran so efficiently that the limiting factor wasn't grinding, it was human coordination. Someone had to be awake to monitor flow, clear jams, and move flour onward. Automation didn't reduce night work, it concentrated it into fewer, more critical moments. Miss one, and everything downstream stalled. Joke 1 slips in quietly. Congratulations. You've invented labor-saving technology that saves everything except sleep. You start to notice how this shifts the baker's night even earlier. If milling finishes late, baking finishes late, and lateness is not forgiven by hungry customers, so bakers hedge. They start earlier than necessary just in case. That just in case is where sleep really dies. Planning for uncertainty means extending the night preemptively. Better to be tired than late, better to lose sleep than reputation. Historians still argue whether centralized milling reduced or increased baker workload. Some suggest it streamlined production, others point out that synchronization created new bottlenecks. If a mill went down, dozens of bakeries felt it immediately. In that scenario, bakers didn't get rest, they got panic. Sleep is the first thing sacrificed when systems interlock too tightly. You picture water wheels turning under starlight, steady and indifferent. They don't care that it's midnight. They don't care that it's raining. They don't care that the person watching them hasn't slept properly in days. This is one of Rome's quiet truths. The more reliable the machine, the more fragile the human becomes. Another mainstream fact drifts in naturally. Flour quality mattered, and inconsistent grinding affected bread texture and taste. Bakers couldn't simply accept whatever came out of the mill. They inspected, adjusted, compensated. That meant more handling, more decision-making, more time awake. Precision expands labor invisibly. Joke 2 lands softly. Turns out even ancient quality control is powered by caffeine-free despair. You feel the layering now. Milling doesn't replace baking labor, it stacks on top of it. One night blends into the next. There's no clean boundary between before work and during work. Everything is work adjacent. Even waiting becomes labor, because waiting happens in anticipation, not rest. Your body never fully stands down. As dawn creeps closer, flour sacks are already in place. The city will wake thinking bread appears naturally, like dew. It doesn't see the chains stretching backward through darkness, mills turning, backs bending, eyes burning. Emperors wake into results, bakers wake into process. Joke 3 settles in gently, like dust on stone. Rome's greatest engine ran on water, grain, and people who didn't sleep enough. You move on from the mills with a deeper understanding of how far back the night reaches. Baking doesn't start at midnight. It starts whenever uncertainty demands insurance against failure. And uncertainty, in a city this large, never sleeps. You notice the soundscape changing now, and it's subtle enough that you almost miss it. Rome is waking up, but not all at once. It does it in layers, first carts, then footsteps, then voices, and finally complaints. And right here, right in this overlap between night labor and daytime expectation, bakers become impossible to ignore. The city hears them before it sees them, and not everyone is grateful. A mainstream historical fact slides in naturally. Roman cities were loud, densely packed, and highly sensitive to disturbance, especially at night and early morning. Noise complaints were not a modern invention. People noticed when mills ground too long, when carts rattled too early, when ovens clanged before sunrise. Bakers, by necessity, sat right in the crosshairs of urban irritation. You're feeding the city, yes, but you're also waking it up. You imagine someone lying on a thin mattress above a shop, hearing stone on stone from a nearby mill, or the dull thud of dough being slapped into shape. That irritation builds fast when sleep is already fragile. Complaints move upward. Sometimes they stick, sometimes they don't. And here's the tension. Bakers cannot be quiet and be on time. Something has to give, and it's rarely the schedule. Here's a quirky tidbit that captures the absurdity. In some Roman cities, regulations targeted how noise was made rather than whether work happened at night. Loud hammering was suspect. Grinding grain, less so. Bakers learned to manage sound like another ingredient, adjusting tools, timing, and placement to stay just under the threshold of official annoyance. Sleep deprivation turns you into an acoustics expert whether you want to be or not. Joke 1 drifts in dryly. Nothing sharpens your awareness of noise laws like the threat of fines at 4 a.m. You feel the social pressure now. Bakers aren't just tired, they're unpopular in a very specific way. Everyone wants bread. No one wants to hear it being made. That contradiction creates resentment. Neighbors complain. Bakers endure. Officials balance order against necessity, often by doing nothing unless things get truly unbearable. This selective enforcement becomes another variable bakers have to factor into already brutal nights. Historians still argue how widespread noise-related enforcement actually was. Some texts suggest active regulation, others imply it was largely ignored unless tied to fire risk or unrest. What's clear is that uncertainty itself costs sleep. When you don't know whether tonight's work will trigger a complaint, you stay more alert, you listen harder, you tense up. Rest becomes impossible even when the body begs for it. You think again of emperors because contrast keeps clarifying the picture. Imperial residences were insulated, physically and socially, from this kind of friction. Thick walls, controlled access. Noise was someone else's problem. If an emperor was disturbed, systems adjusted. If a baker disturbed someone, the baker adjusted or paid. Sleep hierarchy mirrors power hierarchy almost perfectly. Another mainstream fact settles in. Rome's insula, multi-story apartment buildings, packed people tightly together, amplifying sound transmission. Bakers working at ground level affected dozens of sleepers above them. That architectural reality made early morning labor visible in a way that field work, or rural baking, never was. urban bread came with urban consequences. Joke 2 lands softly. It's hard to be a beloved essential worker when you're also the reason someone's baby won't stop crying. You watch how bakers respond. They don't argue loudly. They don't advertise their exhaustion. They adapt quietly. Quieter tools, faster motions. Earlier starts to finish before complaints peak. Ironically, trying to avoid waking people often means waking up even earlier yourself. Sleep loss compounds in the most perverse way possible. As the streets fill, complaints fade, not because they're resolved, but because the city's own noise drowns them out. Once Rome is fully awake, bakeries blend into the background hum. The damage is already done. The sleepless hours have already been spent. The baker doesn't get them back just because the grumbling stops. Joke 3 settles in gently. Rome didn't need alarm clocks. It had bakers. You linger on the idea that public annoyance rarely translates into public empathy. People complain about being woken up by bread production without ever considering what time the baker woke up. That asymmetry defines the relationship. One group loses sleep once, the other loses it every day. As you move on, the city now fully awake around you. You understand that bakers didn't just fight time and heat, they fought perception. They were visible enough to irritate, invisible enough to ignore. And in that narrow space, sleep was always the first casualty. You drift, almost automatically now, toward the other side of the imbalance, the place where sleep is protected instead of spent. You don't need to see the Emperor to feel him. You feel him in the quiet, in the way certain streets soften instead of sharpen as morning approaches. This is where exhaustion stops being universal and starts being selective. A mainstream historical fact settles in without drama. Emperors and elite Romans lived in environments designed to insulate them from disruption. Large residences, controlled access, servants operating in shifts, and schedules that bent around their needs. Even when emperors worked late, that labor was optional, political, or ceremonial. They could recover. Bakers could not. Sleep here is a privilege reinforced by architecture and manpower. You imagine an imperial bedroom at dawn, heavy curtains, thick walls, the city's noise reduced to a distant suggestion. If the emperor wakes early, it's framed as diligence. If he sleeps in, it's framed as deserved rest. Either way, the system adapts to him. That's the key difference. Bakers adapt to the system. Emperors are the system. Joke 1 slips in gently. When you run the empire, your circadian rhythm becomes policy. You notice how effort is perceived differently depending on who loses sleep. An emperor rising before dawn is praised in biographies. A baker rising before dawn is expected. One becomes moral narrative. The other becomes background noise. This isn't accidental. It's how power teaches people what to notice. Historians still argue whether emperors actually slept more than average Romans, or simply slept better. Some sources describe restless rulers plagued by paranoia and plots. Others emphasize structured routines and guarded tranquility. Either way, the quality of imperial rest was fundamentally different. When you sleep knowing someone else is handling the risk, the rest hits deeper. You contrast this with bakers again, because your mind can't help it. Bakers sleep during the day, when heat rises, noise spikes, and bodies never quite cool down. Their rest is fragile, interruptible, shallow. Even if the total hours occasionally match an elite schedule, the experience doesn't. Sleep isn't just about duration, it's about safety. Emperors sleep safe. Bakers sleep alert. Another mainstream fact weaves in quietly. Roman elites often had access to villas outside dense urban cores, providing escape from noise and heat. Bakers did not. Their livelihood chained them to the city's pulse. When Rome rested, they worked. When Rome roared, they tried to sleep. Joke 2 drifts in softly. Turns out, location, location, location applies to naps too. You realize something sharper now. Emperors could choose sleeplessness. They might stay up strategizing, hosting, or worrying. Bakers had sleeplessness chosen for them. And that difference rewires the experience entirely. Chosen fatigue feels temporary. Imposed fatigue feels endless. This is where ideology sneaks in. Roman culture admired discipline and endurance, but only selectively. When elites sacrificed sleep, it was virtue. When workers sacrificed sleep, it was efficiency. Same behavior, different story. That narrative gap ensured no urgency to fix the imbalance. You don't reform what you don't romanticize. Joke 3 lands quietly. almost lazily. Apparently, insomnia is noble if you can afford it. As the morning settles fully in, you feel the Emperor's day beginning. Meetings, appearances, controlled chaos. You feel the baker's day ending in collapse, not celebration. Bread changes hands, responsibility does not. The Emperor eats, the baker fades. You move forward carrying this asymmetry with you. Bakers slept less than emperors, not because emperors were lazy or bakers were heroic, but because Rome engineered comfort upward and exhaustion downward. Sleep followed the same gravity as power, and once that pattern sets, it becomes invisible, unquestioned, and very hard to undo. You notice the calendar pressing in now, not as dates, but as disruptions. Rome does not run on an even rhythm. Festivals arrive, ritual days interrupt routines. Gods demand attention, and when gods get involved, bakers pay for it in sleep. This is where time stops being merely early and starts becoming crowded. A mainstream historical fact settles in naturally. Roman religious festivals were frequent, public, and often accompanied by increased food consumption, offerings, and communal meals. Bread wasn't just daily fuel, it was ritual material. On festival days, demand spiked sharply, and not politely. Bakers didn't get advance rest to compensate. They got advance notice to work more. You imagine the night before a major festival. The city is restless, half awake already. People anticipate processions, sacrifices, gatherings. Bread must be ready earlier, in larger quantities, sometimes in specific shapes or qualities tied to tradition. That means starting even earlier than usual, compressing an already brutal night into something sharper and more anxious. Sleep doesn't just shrink, it fragments into useless slivers. Here's a quirky tidbit that often gets overlooked. Certain breads were associated with specific rituals or deities requiring symbolic forms or ingredients. That sounds charming until you realize it adds another layer of precision to an exhausted workforce. Shape matters. Timing matters. Mistakes aren't just commercial, they're religiously awkward. Nothing heightens pressure like the fear of offending both customers and gods. Joke 1 drifts in softly. Nothing says sacred duty like yelling at dough at 2 a.m. You start to see how religious time collides with labor time. Festivals don't eliminate regular demand, they stack on top of it. People still need their usual bread, plus the extra ceremonial stuff. Bakers can't simply shift production forward because storage ruins freshness. So they stretch the night backward again. Sleep becomes the buffer, sacrificed to keep divine schedules intact. Historians still argue whether festival-driven demand caused temporary spikes in baker exhaustion, or whether it simply intensified an already constant strain. Some sources suggest seasonal rhythms with brief lulls afterward. Others imply there was no true recovery period. Either way, festivals didn't bring rest. They brought obligation disguised as celebration. You think again of emperors, because ritual time worked differently for them. Emperors presided, bakers prepared. One role was visible and symbolic, the other was invisible and essential. If an emperor missed a ritual, it was political. If a baker missed production, it was chaos. Sleep loss again flows downward. Another mainstream fact weaves in quietly. Public religious life in Rome was inseparable from civic order. Feeding crowds wasn't optional. It was part of maintaining favor, stability, and legitimacy. Bakers became unwilling participants in state religion. Their exhaustion converted into social harmony. Joke 2 lands gently. Turns out even the gods preferred fresh bread. You sense the emotional fatigue here, not just physical. Working harder while everyone else celebrates creates a specific kind of resentment. Not rebellion. Rome wasn't built on that, but weariness. Festivals mark time for most people. For bakers, they distort it. What should be breaks become stress tests. Anticipation replaces rest. As dawn breaks on a festival morning, the city feels alive, energized. Bakers feel hollowed out. They've already lived through the hardest part of the day. By the time drums sound and crowds gather, bakers are retreating, hoping for sleep that will be interrupted by noise, heat, and the knowledge that tomorrow brings cleanup, normal demand, and no compensation. Joke 3 slips in quietly, almost tired itself. Rome threw parties on credit, and bakers paid the interest in sleep. You carry that forward now. Religion didn't soothe the baker's night, it sharpened it. Sacred calendars didn't pause labor, they intensified it. And once again, Rome's sense of order depended on someone else's exhaustion staying invisible. As you move on, the echoes of celebration behind you, you understand that bakers slept less than emperors, not just because of economics or law, but because even the sacred schedule of the empire leaned on people who never got enough rest. And in a city where gods walked the streets symbolically, it was always the most human bodies that bore the cost. You feel the anxiety before you fully name it, a tightness that sits somewhere between the ribs and the throat. Fire. Everything about the bakery revolves around fire, and fire never really sleeps. It waits. This is the part of the night where exhaustion sharpens into fear, because one mistake doesn't just ruin bread. It can erase a building, a block, a reputation, a life. A mainstream historical fact settles in steadily. Roman cities were extremely vulnerable to fires, and bakeries were among the most closely watched workplaces because of their constant open flames. Wood-fired ovens, embers, ash pits, and cramped urban construction made bakeries permanent risks. Laws existed to regulate fire safety, but enforcement was uneven, and prevention depended largely on vigilance. Vigilance, unfortunately, is hardest to maintain when you're exhausted. You picture a baker staring into the oven, eyes stinging, trying to decide whether the glow looks normal or dangerous. That judgment matters more at 3 a.m. than at noon, because fewer people are awake to help if something goes wrong. Sleep deprivation dulls reaction time, slows decision-making, and blurs risk assessment. Bakers know this intuitively, even if they don't have the language for it. Fear becomes a substitute for rest. You stay awake because you have to. Here's a quirky tidbit that adds a twist. Some bakeries kept overnight watch specifically to prevent fires, assigning someone to monitor embers long after baking finished. That means even when production ended, sleep still didn't arrive. Someone had to stay alert, listening for the wrong crackle, the wrong smell. Fire demanded company. Joke one slides in quietly, dark but true. Insomnia is easier when the alternative is arson. You notice how this fear reshapes behavior. Bakers overcompensate. They check ovens too often. They keep fires smaller than ideal, then compensate by starting earlier to make up for reduced heat. That trade-off costs time, which costs sleep. Safety doesn't reduce workload, it redistributes it into the night. The city wants bread and safety, and bakers provide both by giving up rest. Historians still argue whether fire regulations meaningfully improved baker safety or simply increased stress. Some evidence suggests stricter rules reduced catastrophic fires. Other accounts imply they pushed bakers into more cautious, time-consuming routines. Either way, the burden didn't lift. It shifted. Anxiety replaced ease. Wakefulness replaced rest. You think again of emperors because fire meant something different to them. Palaces had guards, watchers, redundancy. If something smoldered, someone else noticed. Risk was delegated. Bakers carried it personally. When a fire starts in a bakery, there's no buffer between mistake and consequence. That awareness keeps you awake even when your body begs for sleep. Another mainstream fact weaves in. Rome eventually developed organized firefighting units, but their reach and speed varied. In many cases, especially before imperial reforms, initial response depended on whoever was awake nearby. Bakers, already awake, often became first responders to their own disasters. Sleep loss again converts into unpaid civic service. Joke 2 drifts in softly. Congratulations, you're not just a baker, you're night watch, fire marshal, and liability sponge. As dawn approaches, the fear doesn't disappear. Ovens cool slowly, embers linger, the risk stretches beyond the shift. Bakers leave knowing that someone else might light a fire later, that their building might still be warm, that blame doesn't care about timing. Sleep after that kind of vigilance is shallow, jumpy, haunted by imagined crackles. You feel how this compounds everything you've already seen. Heat, noise, timing pressure, legal ambiguity. All of it sits under the shadow of fire. Sleep becomes dangerous not just because it's scarce, but because letting your guard down feels irresponsible. Bakers don't just work nights, they watch nights. Joke 3 lands quietly, with a tired exhale. Nothing keeps you awake like knowing your job can burn down the neighborhood. As you move on, the city brightening around you, you understand that bakers slept less than emperors because fire made rest feel reckless. Rome demanded constant heat, but punished uncontrolled flame, and bakers lived inside that contradiction. They paid for safety with vigilance, and they paid for vigilance with sleep. The oven's dim behind you now, but the tension doesn't. It follows you forward, an invisible reminder that in Rome, staying awake wasn't just productive, it was preventative. And prevention, as always, came out of the baker's night. You feel the calculation happening now, quietly, constantly, like a ledger that never closes. This is where exhaustion turns economic. Sleep becomes something you trade, not something you lose by accident. Bakers don't talk about it in poetic terms. They talk about survival. If you rest, you risk falling behind. If you fall behind, you risk punishment, official, social, or financial. And in Rome, punishment doesn't always announce itself ahead of time. A mainstream historical fact settles in here with uncomfortable clarity. Bakeries tied into public supply, especially those connected to the grain dole, operated under strict expectations about output, price, and reliability. Failure could mean fines, loss of contracts, or worse. This wasn't a free market where a bad day could be shrugged off. It was a system where consistency mattered more than comfort. Sleep didn't show up on the balance sheet, so it was the easiest thing to spend. You imagine a baker weighing options at midnight. Start earlier and lose more sleep, or risk starting later and miss the market rush. There's no neutral choice. One path costs rest, the other risks income. In that equation, sleep always loses. Not because bakers don't value it, but because Rome doesn't. Hunger punishes faster than fatigue. Here's a quirky tidbit that sharpens the picture. Some bakers accepted official penalties as part of doing business, calculating fines into their operations. What they could not calculate around was time. You can borrow money, you can borrow grain. You cannot borrow an hour at 4 a.m. So they protected time by sacrificing sleep again and again until it felt normal. Joke one slips in dryly. Turns out the original subscription model was pay monthly with your circadian rhythm. You start to see how coercion doesn't always wear chains. Sometimes it wears predictability. If you know exactly what happens when bread is late, you don't need threats. You self-police. You wake yourself up. You push through fatigue because the consequences are familiar and immediate. That's the quiet genius of the system. It doesn't have to shout, it just waits. Historians still argue whether bakers experience this pressure as external punishment or internalized obligation. Did they feel forced, or did they feel responsible? The sources blur, because over time, those distinctions blur in real life too. When survival depends on meeting expectations, expectation starts to feel like choice, even when it isn't. You think again of emperors, because the contrast now feels almost cruel. Emperors worried about legitimacy, conspiracy, image. Bakers worried about whether today's bread would sell before noon. One kind of anxiety is abstract, the other is immediate. When an emperor loses sleep, it's because of thoughts. When a baker loses sleep, it's because of consequences. Another mainstream fact weaves in quietly. Bread prices and availability were politically sensitive, monitored closely to prevent unrest. That scrutiny didn't come with backup labor or enforced rest. It came with accountability. Bakers became shock absorbers for civic anxiety. When things went wrong, blame flowed downhill. Joke 2 lands softly. Rome outsourced stability to people who couldn't afford naps. You feel how this shapes identity. Bakers don't frame themselves as victims. They frame themselves as reliable. Pride sneaks in where choice is limited. You endure the night because endurance becomes proof of worth. That's dangerous because it makes exploitation feel like character. Sleep deprivation becomes a badge instead of a warning sign. And yet, the body keeps score. Mistakes happen, tempers shorten, injuries linger. But none of those show up immediately enough to outweigh the daily math of survival. You don't stop sleeping because you're strong. You stop sleeping because you're trapped in a system where rest has no short-term payoff. Joke 3 drifts in, tired but accurate. Long-term health is a terrible negotiator when tomorrow's rent is due. As dawn gives way to full daylight, bakers finish the transaction. Bread for money, money for survival. Sleep postponed again. They don't think in weeks or months, they think in nights. Can I make it through this one? Can I keep the ovens running without attracting fines, complaints, or disaster? You carry this forward with you now. Bakers slept less than emperors, not because they lacked discipline or foresight, but because the system rewarded reliability and punished delay, and sleep was the only variable flexible enough to absorb that pressure. Rome didn't need to whip bakers into exhaustion. It just needed to make rest economically irrational. And as you move on, you realize that once sleep becomes a cost instead of a need, it's always the poorest, least protected bodies that end up paying full price. You start noticing the bodies now, because after enough nights like this, bodies tell the story even when people don't. Rome doesn't keep medical charts for bakers, but it leaves clues everywhere, in posture, in breath, in the way movements slow just a fraction before they should. Sleeplessness doesn't announce itself dramatically, it accumulates. A mainstream historical fact settles in quietly. Roman medical writers understood that sleep was essential for balance and recovery, even if they explained it in humoral terms rather than modern biology. Too little rest was believed to dry the body, weaken digestion, and dull the mind. In theory, everyone knew sleep mattered. In practice, bakers were expected to function without enough of it anyway. You imagine a baker coughing in the heat, flour dust clinging to sweat-damp skin, eyes red not just from smoke, but from chronic fatigue. This isn't a single bad week, it's a career. Sleep loss erodes resilience slowly, making injuries linger and illnesses harder to shake. A twisted ankle heals poorly when rest is fragmented. A chest infection hangs on when nights never truly end. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost ironic. Some Roman medical advice recommended light baking work for certain conditions because of warmth and routine. That advice makes sense only if you ignore scale, heat, and sleep deprivation. Therapeutic baking, apparently, did not include running an oven all night in a crowded city. Joke one slides in dryly. Ancient wellness advice really went downhill after try not sleeping. You think about longevity next, because it's impossible not to. Did bakers die younger? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Tombstones don't list sleep schedules, but patterns whisper. Trades involving heat, dust, and night work correlate with wear, not vigor. Bakers weren't famous for long, restful retirements. Many worked until they couldn't, then disappeared from records quietly. Historians still argue whether sleeplessness alone significantly shortened bakers' lives, or whether it was simply one factor among many brutal conditions. Some emphasize nutrition and physical strain, others point to respiratory damage and chronic exhaustion. The debate stays unresolved because Rome didn't care enough to count. Absence of data doesn't mean absence of damage, it means absence of concern. You notice something subtler now: mental wear. Sleep deprivation blunts emotion. It flattens joy, sharpens irritation, and makes tomorrow feel closer than it is. Bakers likely lived inside a narrow emotional range, not because they lacked feeling, but because fatigue compresses it. Celebration feels distant. Rest feels theoretical. Everything funnels toward getting through the next shift. Joke 2 drifts in quietly. When you're always tired, even hope starts yawning. You contrast this again with emperors, because the difference now feels physiological. Emperors might suffer stress, paranoia, insomnia during crises, but they also had periods of recovery, travel, villas, controlled environments. Bakers did not cycle out of strain. Their baseline was depletion. That distinction matters more than dramatic anecdotes about sleepless rulers. Another mainstream fact weaves in. Roman urban workers often lived close to their workplaces, blurring boundaries between labor and rest. For bakers, this meant the oven was never fully off, even psychologically. The body learns that night equals work, day equals disrupted sleep. Circadian rhythm bends until it breaks. Joke 3 lands softly, almost kindly. Your internal clock can't keep time if you keep stealing its batteries. You imagine an older baker now, slower hands, aching joints, still waking before night truly ends. There is no pension waiting, no formal retirement, just gradual replacement by younger, stronger bodies who will repeat the same pattern. Sleeplessness becomes generational, passed down not genetically but structurally. As you step back from the image, you realize that Rome didn't need to destroy bakers to use them up. It just needed to let time and fatigue do the work quietly. Sleep loss doesn't kill quickly. It wears people down until absence feels natural. You carry that forward with you. Bakers slept less than emperors, and the cost wasn't just grogginess or irritability. It was health slowly traded for stability, life stretched thinner to keep the city fed. And as you move on, you feel the weight of that exchange, not as outrage, but as a tired, persistent ache, the kind that never quite goes away. You start noticing the bodies now, because after enough nights like this, bodies tell the story even when people don't. Rome doesn't keep medical charts for bakers, but it leaves clues everywhere, in posture, in breath, in the way movements slow just a fraction before they should. Sleeplessness doesn't announce itself dramatically, it accumulates. A mainstream historical fact settles in quietly. Roman medical writers understood that sleep was essential for balance and recovery, even if they explained it in humoral terms rather than modern biology. Too little rest was believed to dry the body, weaken digestion, and dull the mind. In theory, everyone knew sleep mattered. In practice, bakers were expected to function without enough of it anyway. You imagine a baker coughing in the heat, flour dust clinging to sweat-damp skin, eyes red not just from smoke, but from chronic fatigue. This isn't a single bad week, it's a career. Sleep loss erodes resilience slowly, making injuries linger and illnesses harder to shake. A twisted ankle heals poorly when rest is fragmented. A chest infection hangs on when nights never truly end. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost ironic. Some Roman medical advice recommended light baking work for certain conditions because of warmth and routine. That advice makes sense only if you ignore scale, heat, and sleep deprivation. Therapeutic baking, apparently, did not include running an oven all night in a crowded city. Joke one slides in dryly. Ancient wellness advice really went downhill after try not sleeping. You think about longevity next, because it's impossible not to. Did bakers die younger? The evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Tombstones don't list sleep schedules, but patterns whisper. Trades involving heat, dust, and night work correlate with wear, not vigor. Bakers weren't famous for long, restful retirements. Many worked until they couldn't, then disappeared from records quietly. Historians still argue whether sleeplessness alone significantly shortened bakers' lives, or whether it was simply one factor among many brutal conditions. Some emphasize nutrition and physical strain, others point to respiratory damage and chronic exhaustion. The debate stays unresolved because Rome didn't care enough to count. Absence of data doesn't mean absence of damage, it means absence of concern. You notice something subtler now: mental wear. Sleep deprivation blunts emotion. It flattens joy, sharpens irritation, and makes tomorrow feel closer than it is. Bakers likely lived inside a narrow emotional range, not because they lacked feeling, but because fatigue compresses it. Celebration feels distant. Rest feels theoretical. Everything funnels toward getting through the next shift. Joke 2 drifts in quietly. When you're always tired, even hope starts yawning. You contrast this again with emperors, because the difference now feels physiological. Emperors might suffer stress, paranoia, insomnia during crises, but they also had periods of recovery, travel, villas, controlled environments. Bakers did not cycle out of strain. Their baseline was depletion. That distinction matters more than dramatic anecdotes about sleepless rulers. Another mainstream fact weaves in. Roman urban workers often lived close to their workplaces, blurring boundaries between labor and rest. For bakers, this meant the oven was never fully off, even psychologically. The body learns that night equals work, day equals disrupted sleep. Circadian rhythm bends until it breaks. Joke 3 lands softly, almost kindly. Your internal clock can't keep time if you keep stealing its batteries. You imagine an older baker now, slower hands, aching joints, still waking before night truly ends. There is no pension waiting, no formal retirement, just gradual replacement by younger, stronger bodies who will repeat the same pattern. Sleeplessness becomes generational, passed down not genetically but structurally. As you step back from the image, you realize that Rome didn't need to destroy bakers to use them up. It just needed to let time and fatigue do the work quietly. Sleep loss doesn't kill quickly. It wears people down until absence feels natural. You carry that forward with you. Bakers slept less than emperors, and the cost wasn't just grogginess or irritability. It was health slowly traded for stability, life stretched thinner to keep the city fed. And as you move on, you feel the weight of that exchange, not as outrage, but as a tired, persistent ache, the kind that never quite goes away. You arrive at dawn again, but this time you don't rush past it. You let it happen. The sky lightens slowly, like a tired breath finally released, and the city stretches into itself. Markets open, voices overlap, bread changes hands. This is the moment Rome recognizes: morning, commerce, routine. What it doesn't recognize is what just ended. A mainstream historical fact settles in gently. Roman markets typically opened early, and bread was among the first goods sold each day. That timing wasn't symbolic, it was practical. People planned their mornings around food availability. By the time the first buyer tears a loaf open, bakers are already spent. Their workday hasn't begun, it is concluded. You watch customers inspect crusts, weigh loaves in their hands, complain lightly about texture or price. None of this is cruel, it's ordinary. And that ordinariness is the point. Rome's success depended on exhaustion being invisible. If the system worked, no one asked how. Bakers learned to disappear at the exact moment their labor became visible. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost poetic. Some bakers reportedly slept in short bursts immediately after sales, collapsing wherever space allowed before the heat of the day fully set in. These weren't restful sleeps, they were shutdowns, the body taking control when the mind could no longer negotiate. Historians still argue whether bakers viewed dawn as relief or as a warning. Relief, because the night was over. Warning, because the clock had already started ticking toward the next one. That ambiguity lingers in the air as you watch them fade from the street. You contrast this again, one last time, with emperors. Imperial mornings begin with control, audiences, decisions, layered protection. Bakers' mornings end with surrender. Bread sold, energy gone, sleep attempted. One role faces the day, the other retreats from it. Joke one lands softly. Rome woke up refreshed, because someone else already used up the night. You stand there as the bakery doors close or grow quiet. The ovens cool slowly, stubbornly, like they don't believe the work is really done. Bakers don't celebrate. They don't linger. They simply vanish into rooms that are already too bright, too warm, too loud for real rest. Joke 2 drifts in, almost kindly. Daylight is a terrible bedtime story. And here's the final truth, the one that's been humming under every section. Bakers slept less than emperors, not because they failed to manage time, but because Rome managed time through them. Their sleeplessness wasn't accidental, it was functional. It absorbed uncertainty, demand, law, ritual, and fear, and turned it into something solid you could hold and eat. Joke 3 settles gently. Civilization runs best when someone else is tired. You let that thought sit, not heavy, just honest. Rome didn't collapse because bakers were exhausted. It endured because they were. And that endurance came at a cost measured not in coins or grain, but in nights that never quite belonged to the people living them. Wind down, now the pace softens. You don't need to hold on to the details anymore. The ovens dim in your imagination. The city noise fades into a distant murmur, like waves against stone. Bakers are sleeping now, or trying to, wrapped in light and fatigue, while Rome continues without noticing. You don't need to judge this system, you just need to see it. To recognize that behind every smooth morning, every predictable routine, there's often someone whose rest was traded quietly so everything else could feel stable. That's not just Roman, that's human. But tonight, you let it stay Roman, distant enough to be gentle. The streets blur, the market dissolves. Bread becomes just bread again, not effort, not heat, not vigilance. The night that shaped it recedes, and with it, the weight of knowing exactly how early everything truly begins. You can let your thoughts slow now. There's nothing left to track, nothing left to compare. Just the idea of a city breathing in rhythm, uneven but steady, carried forward by people you don't need to remember individually for their labor to have mattered. Your breathing evens out. The fan hums. The story loosens its grip. Rome sleeps. The ovens rest. And you don't need to stay awake anymore. End of script. Sweet dreams.